Hi, this is Kevin Trainer. Welcome to my briefing for Chapter 5 of the Pinkham book, Django Unleashed. Chapter 5 is about creating web pages with controllers in Django. And I'm going to try to make this fairly brief. The tutorial that's coming up for the project that we're doing, the Easy University project, is pretty long. There's a lot of work there. And so what I'm going to try to do is to stick to the highlights of this chapter so as to not have you dealing with too many long videos. Um, the difference between the approach that I'm taking in this briefing and the tutorial is that in this chapter, Pinkham really shows an evolution of the approach to the parts that he's talking about. And he kind of shows you the naive way and a slightly more sophisticated way, and then a shortcut way, and then what he considers maybe a better way. And he talks you through all of them. It's a pretty long chapter. Um, in the tutorial, I pick a way, typically the last one that he discusses, and we just do it that way. Okay, so when you're going through this, if you want to follow along with the examples from the chapter, I recommend copying the files rather than typing, because there's a lot of code and there are several versions of most things. Uh, he begins the chapter with this great diagram of model view controller architecture. Um, Model view controller is an architectural pattern that's been very popular in web applications in, well, for a long time, maybe for close to 20 years. So quite some time. And the the Django framework uses model view controller concepts, but it's more atomic. Okay, so the thing to remember here is there are four parts to Django, four main parts. Um, uh, URLs.py, um, uh, models.py, views.py, and then the template files, some name.html, right? And so the correspondence is for the model in model view controller. Well, models.py takes care of that. For the view in model view controller, uh, the template files in Django take care of that. And for the C, the controller in model view controller architectural pattern, there are two Django parts that contribute to that, the URLs.py and the views.py. And this chapter is about URLs.py and views.py. So it's all about the controller. Okay. So um, he does a pretty good job of explaining that the uh, the web app that we have is going to be navigated with a URL based API, a RESTful URL based API. And he kind of explains his way through general principles, okay? And he kind of talks about how his is designed. So, for instance, if you have the domain name /startup, you get the startup list. And then, does he actually talk about? Then, eventually, what's going to happen is that if you want startup of a particular name, he's going to have you go and add a parameter after the slash. So it's going to be startup. I'm forgetting whether he uses names or numbers. In our tutorial part, we use numbers. We use the primary keys of the instructors, the students, the sections, the semesters, and the courses. Right? So you get a pretty good discussion of that here. He begins to talk about the views, and at this point we're using function-based views, just like we were using at the end of chapter 4. Okay, and this is a lot like the code that I had you doing at the end of your last tutorial. Okay, except that I had gone ahead and we had given up on this home page idea. Okay, and we were actually calling it we were calling ours the instructor list view, and we were going from there. He starts to talk a little bit here about how to use the URL patterns, and we covered a little bit more of that with chapter 4 than he did in the chapter. So you won't be surprised by that. And what starts to happen here is you start to see that there's a correlation between the URL patterns and then you forward to the view and you take care of the view the right way. Now, his code is complicated in some ways by the fact that he's using these identifiers called slugs, and they are less precise than our primary keys are going to be for our instructors, students, etc. So he's trying to do an inexact match to the slug to allow for, say, some typos and capitalization differences and all of that kind of stuff. And he's starting to tell us what's going to go on a detail page. Okay, so in the view for a tag a detail, okay, he first retrieves the model object that he wants. So it's a detail page, so he gets one. He doesn't get a list back. He gets a single one. And then he takes a similar approach that we've been taking to loading the template, and then he puts the tag reference into the context, and then he does the rendering, which causes the template to be called. Okay, so not too different than what we did in the list, except that in the list we were bringing back a list of references to tags, and now we're bringing back only one. Okay, so instead of a tag list or a startup list, we have just a tag, and we put that into the context. So he keeps improving things, okay? So he improves and he improves and he improves, okay? One of the things that he shows us is in the URL patterns, we need to have a more sophisticated regular expression pattern as part of it, because we need to identify the key for the individual that we're trying to retrieve, that we're trying to do the get for, And so we have this kind of general approach here where we have a grouping of characters. That's what these parentheses do. And we want to save the grouping and we want to put it into a variable called slug. That's what all these characters up front do. And then we've got this kind of pattern here that is saying, well, what are we going to get? Well, we're going to get a bunch of characters in a row that are either non-white space or hyphens, and we're going to have one or more of them. That's what the plus means. Okay? And so far he just has the regular expression, and he points us to the view that we want to go to. So these things improve through several versions. Okay, and we eventually get down to a version of the URL. Let me go down and show you the final version of the URL that he gets to. In fact, I'm just going to pause this and find exactly what I want to show you. Okay, we got pretty far down here. It's on example 5.38. But the URL pattern, we already know that simple one for the home page. But the next one here, this is where instead of looking for a tag list, he's looking for an individual tag. And so he's got kind of the expression that we saw before. So we saw that. We also see that he has the name of the view. But the third thing that he has here, he's added, and we're going to be doing this, he is giving a name to this whole thing together, this thing that's inside the parens of the URL. It's called a URL pattern. That's why the list of them is called URL patterns. It turns out that we're going to use these in the opposite direction when we're building the href attributes to populate, to make all of our links active. And to be able to use these, we have to be able to refer to them by name. So this is a chapter where we have three parts to these URL patterns. We have the regular expression pattern, we have a name, we have a reference to the view, and then we have a name that allows us eventually to point back to this URL pattern. You'll notice that when I do this in the tutorial that I use a similar scheme for the name where I include the name of the app, the name of the view associated with it, but at the end I put a URL pattern just to make it clear that that's what this name is for. Okay, and we're not going to use them today. We're going to use them next week when we start to make all the links work. The other thing he shows us with respect to the URLs that is interesting is that we started out with only one urls.py file, and that was under the name of the overall project, and not one for the app. And he says that it's typical to have a urls.py for every app. And so what does the one for the whole project do? Well, we use it to mainly to point to things that are subparts. So we have one match that's going to point to the administrative tools, and then he's going to have one that points to the urls.py for his post application, and one for the blog application, and one for the organizer application. Okay, so this idea that for every app you have a urls.py is a common and good practice. So you'll see that we follow this in the tutorial as well. Okay, so what happens eventually is we get down to um, we get down to one. He's got one for the organizer here, uh, and then he's got one somewhere here for the pit for the whole project. Okay, and he's got so many versions of it that it's going to take a while to go. So now the only thing that changes in these patterns from the beginning to the end is as we learn about a different kind of view, which is a class-based view rather than a function-based view. Instead of having the name of the function-based view here in the second position in the URL pattern, we just have a reference to the name of the class-based view, but that's going to be a change that comes along during the chapter. So that's a lot of what's happening on the URL side in the chapter. And now I'm going to reposition here. I'll put you on pause, and we'll talk about the changes that happen to the view side over the chapter. So we've already seen this at the beginning of the chapter. These function-based views, they look pretty much like they did at the end of chapter 4. And in fact, we had gone so far as to not rely on the link to the home page. We had gone so far as to actually have the URL string in for our various parts of our model, and we had individual views for each one that were properly named, but they essentially work like this. Okay, and what happens is he just gets more sophisticated over the chapter. Where does he go? Well, let's look at where he goes. Trying to find something that we didn't get to yet. One of the things that we're going to be looking for is in these APIs that we have, these web APIs that are based on URLs. We typically, the design is the combination of the domain name, and then we typically have the name of the resource that we're trying to access. In his case, it's a tag. And then if in fact we're looking for a detail page, then we want to have some kind of a key expression for the tag in the next slot. Okay, and he shows us that the proper response when you ask for a resource that you don't have is to get a 404 page back. Okay, well, he gets it does not exist, but you'll eventually be getting a 404 resource not found page. Okay. He has, I think, an interesting development here where he says, look, in a detail page, you're going to have a requested individual instance of the model, a row from a table that you're looking for, and you might not find it. So you might have to put it into a try except block and raise a 404 page if the tag that you're looking for does not exist. Okay, so that's fine. He's capturing the error that we saw back there. Okay, what happens though is that there's a shortcut for this. Okay, so instead of having this try except block in here, he eventually pretty quickly comes down to another version that we're going to go through and find that's simplified and uses a shortcut. And it uses this thing called get object or 404. So it's just a shortcut. It's code that calls code like the code that we have, but you can call it at a higher level. And let's find one for hours. Yeah. I'll find it here soon. Um, right here. So here's the tag details. So this is the refactored version of the view for a detail page, tag detail. And you can see that now we're using get object or 404, and we're passing it the information to find our tag. And either we're going to get the object back, or it's going to send a 404 page and quit. Okay? And then on the basis of that, we have the tag. Then we go on and we do the template and the context and all that stuff. So the mechanics of the back part of this are the same, but we've really shortcut the front part from the first version he showed us a little while ago. So there are more shortcuts coming. Okay? So let's go down and find the even more shortcut version. Okay, and that's this one down here on 5.31. Okay, so we have this shortcut version on the top. Okay, but it turns out, and when I say shortcut version, I mean it. We are actually importing from Django.shortcuts, so that's the name of the package. We are importing one that we used already, get object or 404, and now we're going to use another shortcut called render. Okay, and so what do? Well, we call when we compress the second half of this, we just say that we want to return render the request. We point to the template, and then we give it a context. Okay, so now now we've kind of streamlined the views. They're about half the size that they were. Okay, and you can't really see quite so much of the workflow and the mechanics and all that. That's the reason why he had you build the more explicit version before. But this is the version that we're going to be using, and this is a good practice. Okay, so this is where we end up. All right. Let's see. Now I'm going to take a pause and figure out just what else I want to talk about. Okay, we're back. So one of the big changes that happens within the chapter, we spend most of the chapter working with those plain old function-based views that we learned about in chapter 4, and they work just fine. Okay, they are they're not robust. Okay, among other things, the versions that we're doing right now don't check to see a lot of the details about the request that's coming from the browser. So the requests coming from the browser are using the HTTP protocol, and you not only get a request, but each request has a method. Okay, and the one that we're going to be using a lot at this part in the course is called the get. And the get is what happens when you type just a plain old bare URL in on the address bar, or when you click on a link. And not a button. When you click on a button, you usually get something other than a get. You usually get a post. But in this case, we're going to be handling a get. Okay, and there really isn't there. He shows us some ways that we can use function-based views and still check to make sure that if somebody appears to be asking for a list of startups or a startup detail page, that they are actually they're asking for it the right way with an HTTP GET. But it's pretty involved, okay? And it's not the last way that he decides to do it. The last way that he decides to do it is with this thing called a class-based view. And it's still code that goes into views.py, but it looks different, okay? And let's, well, okay, so one of the problems I don't like about his blog is that there are things in these blogs called posts. You know, you send a post to a blog. Well, it turns out that there is a method of HTTP called post. So post list is a little confusing. That's why I like Easy University better than this blog app. But here he's just doing the list for the posts, and whereas before we would have had something that said def post list view, okay. Instead of that, what we've got is we have a class called post list. It's a subclass of the view superclass, so it gets a lot of functionality for free from its superclass. And then at this point, because we only need to respond to a get, somebody clicking on a link, it has the method get, and it's only going to service a get. So if somebody sends us the wrong HTTP method and they send it to a post list, what's going to happen is it's going to send back an error and say, I don't service those. So this is much more error checking and robust. So that's what we mean by get here. The self just means that this is an object-oriented method instead of the function we had before. We have to pass the request, and he's fooling around with parent templates. We're not fooling around with that kind of stuff. So it's just this. Okay, so it's not a big change, all right? And he goes through the advantages of class-based views and how you could patch up function-based views if you want to get some of the advantage of class-based views and not have to worry about them or quite understand them. But he eventually says that he's going to use them, and I'm telling you that I'm going to use them. So in the course of the chapter, we start to get rid of the function-based views, and in my tutorial that you'll be doing, over the course of that, we get rid of all the function-based views, and by the end of that, we replace them by the time we get to the end of the assignment. Okay? And then putting it all together. So when we get done with the chapter, we should understand this controller part, which of course has two Django components, URLs and views. We should understand that about as well as we're going to understand them. This is our big chapter for those. Okay, so we're going to spend time coding the URLs and coding the views. We didn't do all the templates back in chapter 4 when we were doing our tutorial part for Easy University. So we're also going to cover templates for detail pages while we're here. But you'll get the idea that having created the model at the beginning of the project, which is pretty typical, then as we work our way through it, we're going to go through a series of add something to URLs, add something to views, create a template, test. Okay? And when you do the tutorial part for Easy University, that's the workflow that you're going to be using. I've got to say that the chapter here, one, it's really long. Certainly don't try to type the code in. Copy it in if you're going to run it. One of the things that you can do is perhaps spin the code all the way up to the end, and then go back and see what you can make run. I think that's about it for the chapter. Okay. Don't get distracted by the fact that he shows you 3 or 4 or 5 different options for views. Okay, we're going to settle on class-based views that use the shortcut methods and are pretty compact and easy to understand. And so a lot of the versions that he entertains and discards over the course of the chapter are nice to know about in some kind of learning sense, but they're not things that we're going to have to produce. So having said that, I'm going to cut this off so you have time to get to the reading and the tutorial. I'll say bye and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.